Hmm.
Okay, Jack, you can go ahead and begin now. Thank you.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Johns Hopkins Alumni Weekend Goes Virtual, and welcome especially to this JHU Press author meet and greet with Kathleen Waters-Sander, who will be discussing her wonderful biography of Mary Elizabeth Garrett. I'm Jack Holmes. I'm a longtime staff member at Hopkins Press. I work there as a publicist now. I'm coming to you from my backyard in North Baltimore. It's not the Decker Quad, but it's, you know, maybe the next best thing. I hope you all are in some place equally present. We've had a nice cool spring in Baltimore. This would be a really nice weekend for Alumni Weekend, but we've made the right decision, and we hope you all are safe and healthy and happy at home. We're certainly looking forward to gathering back in Baltimore and at Hoboken campus soon, but we're very grateful to the Alumni Association for putting this virtual gathering together, helping us out today. And we're especially grateful for our colleagues in the alumni office, Sydney Dawson, Abby Mahan, and Rachel Dolliner. They're kind of the behind the scenes technical people, but have done a lot of work in advance along with other staff members to make this all possible. So we're very grateful to them, and so grateful that you all have joined us today. Before I introduce Kathy Sander, I wanted to just take a minute to mention two things to you. One, of course, whenever we have occasions like this, it's great to remind Hopkins alums, invite you to pay attention to Johns Hopkins University Press, the oldest university press in the United States, one of the largest and most innovative. We publish books, we publish journals, we offer publishing services. We operate some amazing, I hope you all are familiar with Project Muse, an amazing, huge database of scholarship, book and journal content. So there's a lot to be interested in about the press, and we hope you can pay attention to that. You can see all about us at the website press.jhu.edu. We also invite you to take advantage of your alumni discount. Alums get a 25% discount when you buy directly from the press. That'll be true of Kathy's books. And you can see actually the code for this is HJAY, like Blue Jay. You get a 25% discount. You can read more about this. The crab cake session that is tomorrow has some information about the discount, so you can look for it there. The other thing I wanted to mention is that today's program is part of a really wonderful initiative at Hopkins to commemorate the centennial of women's suffrage, the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The university is doing all kinds of really interesting programs. Unfortunately, some of the physical programs had to be canceled this semester, but there's a whole lot online and there's a lot coming. I bet a lot of it's going to become virtual in the fall. It's a wonderful initiative that was kind of championed by Senator Barbara Mikulski, who you know is on the staff here now. You can find out more about all of this at a great website that's been created with lots of resources and materials. That's Women's Vote 100. So Women's, W-M-E-N-S, Vote 100.jhu.edu. And you can also look at, if you've received the current issue of Arts and Sciences magazine, there's some profiles of different people, including Senator Mikulski, a lot of information about what the university is doing to commemorate the suffrage centennial. So keep an eye on that website for plans coming up in the future. Maryland's former Senator Barbara Mikulski was the advocate for the celebration. She was also, she's always been a great advocate for Mary Elizabeth Garrett and her important role at Hopkins, in Baltimore, and in Maryland, and in the national suffrage movement. So the book that was published, Kathy's book, Mary Elizabeth Garrett, Society and Philanthropy in the Gilded Age, with this wonderful John Singer Sargent portrait as the cover. This was published in 2008 and really helped to remind the Hopkins community of Mary Elizabeth Garrett's important role in our founding and in our history, especially giving the money that allowed the medical school to open and stipulating that it admit women on equal footing with men. It turns out that Garrett was also a kind of unsung hero of the suffrage movement and helped it both financially, of course, but helped it with kind of her savvy sense of how politics and business worked. And that's very much a part of Kathy's biography, and we'll hear about that today. So the press, as part of the centennial this year, is publishing, or has published, a paperback edition of the biography with a new foreword by Senator Mikulski, a kind of rousing, cheerleading forward about the Garrett history. So we invite you to take a look at all of that. I wanted to mention that you should see on your screen an opportunity to submit questions, and you can submit those questions or comments throughout Kathy's presentation. Kathy's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A. You can submit those questions and comments anytime, and then after about 30 minutes, I'll facilitate the Q&A by reading your questions, and Kathy will answer those as well. So note that you can do that throughout the presentation. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce Kathleen Waters Sanders to you today. She is a longtime teacher of history at the University of Maryland Global Campus. In addition to the Garrett biography, Mary Elizabeth Garrett, Society and Philanthropy in the Gilded Age, she's the author of The Business of Charity, The Women's Exchange Movement, 1832 to 1900. If any of you back in the day were in Baltimore when the wonderful Women's Industrial Exchange was serving those lunches of tomato aspic and chicken salad, that's the movement
food.
that, comfort food indeed. That's the movement, the national movement that Kathy wrote a book about. She also wrote another book for Hopkins Press called John W. Garrett and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. J.W. Garrett is Mary Elizabeth's father. So thank you all for coming and joining us today. And please virtually, I don't know how we do this virtually, but please join me in welcoming Kathy Sanders today.
Okay, well, thank you, Jack. That was very nice. And I'm so glad you mentioned Senator Mikulski, who's a big part of this story, of course, especially with the new paperback. And I can never resist talking about how I first met Senator Mikulski and learned of her great admiration for Mary Garrett. And this was probably about 20 years ago. And we were having a luncheon at the Women's Exchange in Baltimore on North Charles Street. And I had just finished that book on the exchange movement. And I mentioned to her, oh, so shyly, that I was interested in Mary Elizabeth Garrett. Oh, she said, you have to write that story. That is such an important story. We have to get the Mary Garrett story out there. And she's sort of pounding on the table. And I thought, well, you have to do what Senator Mikulski tells you to do. But anyway, the book finally arrived. It took 8 years, but it was great to research Mary Garrett and to uncover, as you said, all the unheralded activism that she was involved in. So she was like, Senator Mikulski was like Mary Garrett in that she was a great advocate for women's advancement and job opportunities. Senator Mikulski is now retired from the Senate, but she was the longest serving member of Congress, 10 years in the House, 30 years in the Senate. And during those 40 years, she did a lot for women's advancement. And so I can see why she greatly admires Mary Garrett, because they both had the same goals in mind, to open opportunities for women and to break down all those restrictions. So that being said, I want to talk about two of Mary's great philanthropies and issues that she was involved in. She did so many things, but since we only have a few minutes and you're all moving on to other things after this, I want to talk about the founding of the medical school, which was so important to elevating American medicine, American medical education, and medical philanthropy. And also we'll talk about suffrage, because she became very involved in that. So just a brief biography about Mary. She was born in Baltimore, 1854, to a very wealthy family, very prominent by that time. Her grandfather had come to Baltimore around 1800 and became a merchant, very successful one. And he came to Baltimore at the same time as other well-known names, or names that became well-known, Johns Hopkins, and they became great friends, Enoch Pratt, George Peabody. They were all young merchants, and they formed social and business relationships. So Mary was not only had a very privileged background, but she had one that was really invigorated by being around very important people. And her father became president of the B&O Railroad in 1858. And as you all know from your history lessons, being a railroad tycoon in the 19th century meant two things, and that's that you were very influential and you became very rich, and John Garrett did both. So as Mary grew up, she had an education unlike most young women, in that she traveled with her father. When she became a late adolescent, late teens, she began to travel with her father on railroad business, and she became his secretary. And she would sit in on railroad business meetings, and you can imagine how harmonious those were. But she learned how to strike a deal and how to stand her ground, and that would be very important to her career in activism and philanthropy. So when her father died in 1884, he left her a small fortune, $6.5 million, and that was a huge amount at that time. And this is at a time when a female factory worker would earn $350 a year. But when Mary inherited all of that money, she decided she wanted to help women. She did not particularly want to spend all of her money living well, although she did some of that. But she spent the great deal of her fortune on giving her wealth to different organizations that would promise to promote women. And she, in the late 1880s, the Johns Hopkins University had opened in 1876. And Johns Hopkins, the man, died 1873, and he left this huge fortune of $7 million to be divided equally between the hospital, building a hospital, and starting a university. And so everything went pretty much according to plan with the university. It opened in a small building in downtown Baltimore because at that time, higher education was just small business, not like it is now. And it opened up in a very humble building downtown. And then the hospital was under construction over in East Baltimore, and that promised to be the greatest hospital in the country, because by that time, medical researchers were learning more about infectious diseases and cures. And so the Hopkins Hospital got a lot of press all over the country. And so eventually the 13-building complex opened up in 1889. But because it had gotten so much press over the years, everyone meaning the media and a lot of people, wanted to know where were the medical classes that Johns Hopkins, the man, had promised that he was going to start. He had wanted to establish a medical school that was very research-based and very enlightened and very advanced. But the problem was the university ran out of money. And this, of course, happens a lot, as we well know, economies go up and down. But so President Gilman searched high and low for a male donor, and he couldn't find one because medical philanthropy was not high on anyone's list. And finally, Mary Garrett, who had been very associated with the Hopkins Medical School, with Hopkins in general, decided that she was going to start this medical school, or she was going to give the money to start the medical school. And this was not a great time for women in education. I want to read you this quote, which is my very favorite quote, because the first time I ever gave a talk about Mary Garrett was to a group of medical students and medical faculty over on the East Baltimore campus. And I read them this quote, and they just all burst out laughing. Okay, this is what women were fighting against as far as higher education and getting into medical school. The most prominent medical writer of the time, Dr. E.H. Clark, said this about women and education. Basically, he said that too much education would give women, quote, monstrous brains and puny bodies, abnormally active cerebration, and abnormally weak digestion, flowing thought, and constipated bowels. So there was just this prevalent thought in the late 19th century. Women did not need more education. They certainly did not need to go to medical school, as Mary Garrett and her cohorts had wanted. But Mary came forward in the Christmas of 1892 with the money that the trustees needed to start the medical school, and that was $500,000. She gave not all of that, but most of it. But she had several restrictions, several caveats, and the trustees were not pleased about this. First of all, she wanted women applicants to be accepted on the same terms as men. And this was just an audacious thought, because women were not allowed in medical schools at that time. And as that quote indicated, they were deemed to be intellectually inferior to even understanding much of anything. And she also wanted the medical school to be research-based and a graduate school. Again, this was very, very revolutionary, because medical schools at that time were like proprietary schools now. They were vocational, they were 3 years. Students didn't have to have any sort of academic background. In fact, you could hang out your sign on Main Street and say you were going to practice medicine. So Mary said, I want this to be a graduate school. I want women to be admitted, and I want the students to be fluent in German and French, and that would indicate that they had had some education. Well, when she presented these terms and her money in December of 1892, the trustees just balked at this. I mean, they just could not accept this, simply because of the feeling about women being educated. And also Harvard had tried to raise their standards and include women, and they almost went out of business. So President Gilman at the time went over to Mary's mansion, as did many of the trustees, pleading with her, please, please lower these standards. We have to have this medical school, but we cannot open it with these standards. And Mary, the woman who had sat in on all those railroad meetings and knew how to just hold her own and to negotiate, said, no, my money is on the table, and if you want it, you can take it, but these are my terms. And finally, after 2 or 3 months of going back and forth, the trustees said, okay, we have to take this. And that was in February of 1893, and the medical school opened that fall, 6 months later, to great success. It was flooded with applicants, very highly qualified applicants. And there were, in that first class, 15 men and 3 women. And that really made history. And not only did it raise medical education, but also medical philanthropy, because before that time, no one wanted to invest in medicine. And with Mary's big gift to Hopkins, a lot of other philanthropists sat up and took notice, like the Rockefellers. And I think the Rockefeller Foundation is still involved with funding a lot of programs at the medical school and hospital. But anyway, so she opened the door to elevate medical education and medical practice, because Johns Hopkins had wanted to have the research done in the medical school and then applied to patients. And that today we know is bench to bedside practice. And so that really changed everything. And also, as I said, changed philanthropy too. So the medical school opened. It was a great success. The hospital had opened a few years earlier to great success. So Hopkins medicine was truly on the map. And the New York Times pronounced the hospital as being the most significant institution of its kind in the world. So that made everyone happy. So in 1910, Simon Flexner did a survey of all the medical schools in the country and in Canada. And he found that Hopkins was the best because of its high standards. And over the next decades, most medical school, most universities followed suit. So Mary was very pleased with that. She kept a close eye on everything over at the medical school. If she found something wasn't to her liking, she would summon the trustees to come over to her house, and she would want to know why. She kept in touch with the first women students, and she would invite them over to her house for tea. Some of them wrote that they didn't like that because she interrogated them, but she wanted to know why or how they were being treated in the medical school. Well, of course, they weren't being treated well. They were women, and a lot of the professors were very reluctant to teach anatomy and body parts. This is the Victorian era. And so, did I lose all of you? Are you there? Oh.
I'm here. You're good.
Okay, wait. I'm getting some sort of weird phone call or something. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. All good.
Okay, because my screen just went somewhere. Anyway, there you are. So she would interrogate them, and she wanted to know how they were being treated. They were just not, everyone made fun of them. But anyway, they survived. They were strong women. Around this time, Mary became interested in suffrage. And suffrage to her just represented everything that she wanted for women. At that time, it was assumed that women, if they had the vote, they would be fully integrated into society. We know that's not true, but at the time, it was that feeling that to be enfranchised would give women more clout politically. So in the 1890s, when she was doing all of her medical school philanthropy and everything else, she became involved in the suffrage movement. And in 1905, she met with Susan B. Anthony and Anna Howe Shaw, wait, I get her name mixed up, who was president of the Suffrage Association. She met with the two leaders, and she suggested that the next suffrage meeting be held in Baltimore. Well, no one was really happy about that. The leaders weren't happy about that because Baltimore was such a conservative city. This was 40 years after the Civil War, but Baltimore still held on to its vestiges of the Old South. And the leaders were afraid to have the suffrage movement come to town. In fact, one of them came up with another quote. I love these old quotes. Quote, "Baltimore's a southern city, so steeped in conservatism that while its citizens mean well, metaphorically, it had never really discarded its ruffles and silver buckles." So you can see that they didn't think that suffrage the convention would do very well in such a conservative town. But they were wrong. In 1906, the suffrage convention came to Baltimore, and it was a great success for many reasons. First of all, the suffragists at that time were sort of like rock stars. They were such well-known women, yes, and very controversial, but highly admired by others. And the press could not get enough of them here in Baltimore. And so the convention was also important because suffrage at that time was really sort of fading financially, and it also needed to bring in more young college girls and cast a wider net to bring in more middle-class women. And at that time, it was still sort of a militant organization. And so they wanted to sort of tone down that militancy. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the most militant of all. And she had died a couple of years before. And but she was really the one responsible for stirring things up. Anyway, in February of 1906, all the suffragists came to town. And they met at the Lyric Theater for 11 days. They had great stirring um, conversations and lectures. Susan B. Anthony, who was really revered at that time, came down from Rochester in the cold weather, the winter weather. And when she arrived at Mary's house in February, she was quite ill. And Mary was concerned because she was 86 years old. Anthony was 86 years old at this point. And of course, people were concerned about her health. And so Mary offered to bring over some of the Hopkins doctors who she kept in touch with, and she was friends with several of them. And she wanted to bring them over to take a look at Anthony. And Anthony said, no, I don't want anyone fussing over me. Don't do that. But Mary, again, had the doctors dress up as butlers, and then she had the nurses dress up as maids, and they took care of Anthony anyway. But so the convention was very successful, and it brought in the more middle-class women, but it still was suffering financially. And when Susan B. Anthony went back up to Rochester, she died a couple of weeks later after the convention. And before she left Baltimore, she sat down and she talked with Mary. And she said, we have to raise some money. We have to get some money in the coffers. We don't have any. And so Mary and her cohorts raised money, and they for the Susan B. Anthony Fund. And they raised several $1,000s within a few weeks. And so they were very pleased about that. And so anyway, Mary unfortunately did not live to see the passage of the amendment in 1920. She died in 1915. She had been living part-time up at Bryn Mawr College, and she traveled quite a bit in her later years. She was estranged from her family in Baltimore, and she traveled quite a bit around the world, stayed with friends. But she most loved to be up at Bryn Mawr College because that was becoming really a vortex of feminism and progressive thought. And she loved being there. And of course, Martha Carey Thomas, president of Bryn Mawr College, was Mary's lifelong friend. And so they had a great companionship. So Mary was living up at Bryn Mawr College and she was appointed as a trustee, which was great for her. And she died in 1915 and of leukemia. And unfortunately, as I said, she didn't see the passage of the amendment that meant so much to her. And but she would come back to, when she was living up at Bryn Mawr, she would occasionally come back to Baltimore. She had a grand mansion on Mount Vernon Place in Baltimore. And and during the convention, that was the center where all the VIPs stayed. And they had great gala parties there, and it was just, she always entertained lavishly. And she would come back occasionally to Baltimore when she had pretty much moved up to Bryn Mawr and Rome. She spent a great deal of time in Rome. And she would come back and participate in the parades around Baltimore, the suffrage parades. And these must have been something to see. If you can ever find a picture of some of these parades, they're wonderful. The women would dress in their Roman outfits and climb on chariots and just ride through the streets of Baltimore and to make the point about suffrage. Well, unfortunately though, Maryland did not pass the suffrage amendment until 1941. And it went into law in 1920 because at that point, 75% of the states had ratified it. And so that was okay, but Maryland was a little slow to do that. But fortunately, other states were not. So the amendment went into law after that. So Mary was very pleased about having the ability to vote. She had been quite miffed that her male servants could vote and she couldn't. So, you know, this would have been very great for her to be able to vote, but she unfortunately didn't. And so her legacy continues on. She has the great medical school to her credit. She started Bryn Mawr School in Baltimore. If any of you are from Baltimore, you're familiar with that. That was again a trailblazing school for young girls. It's still around. She supported the Bryn Mawr College, and with $10,000 a year. And as I said, at that point, colleges lived hand to mouth, and they had not a penny left in their budgets at the end of the year. So $10,000 for a small college was a lot. And she did a lot to support scholarships and faculty development and build buildings on the campus. So she left behind quite a great legacy. And I'm glad that, as Senator Mikulski said, we're getting the story out there. So thank you to the press for publishing the books, and we'll continue to crusade for Mary Garrett's name. So, any questions? Oh.
Yeah, so folks, we invite you to submit questions through the, there's a tab if you touch your screen, you'll see a toolbar that appears at the top, and you can touch the Q&A tab to submit a question. We do have one about, Kathy, along with like providing the funds and, you know, the requiring that women be admitted to the medical school, it's always been interesting that she was an advocate for medical school being graduate level education. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, was that an unusual idea at the time, and was it controversial? And was there kind of a movement or trend that she was picking up on? Were other people advocating for graduate education for medical school? And put that into some context in terms of what was happening in education at the time.
Sure. Well, she modeled that very much on the European medical schools, which required a graduate degree. And I believe even now, medical students in European medical schools have to write dissertations as well as go through all their medical residencies and such. They were very much research-based. And Mary Garrett's companion, Martha Carey Thomas, had studied in Europe and had been influenced by that. And also, some of the original faculty at the university had advocated for that as well. But the problem was they had no money to start such a medical school. So the idea was definitely floating around out there. But again, because of her longtime association with her family's relationship with the man, Johns Hopkins, they knew, and she knew, what he wanted for his medical school. And she was very determined to fulfill his wishes. Johns Hopkins and Mary's father and her grandfather had a very close business relationship and social, but also Johns Hopkins was sort of a mentor to Mary's father in the early years of his B&O presidency. So there was just this long generational relationship, and Mary very much wanted to fulfill her family's friends' wishes for his medical school and university.
Thank you. We have a question from Allison Seiler. Allison, thank you for submitting this. So Kathy, talk more about Mary Elizabeth Garrett's friendships and their Friday evening meetings. Are there any archival records that show what they talked about at these meetings?
Oh, well, there are lots of records. Mary Garrett loved to communicate. And as we were putting together this presentation with the alumni office and everything, I was thinking how Mary would have loved Zoom and FaceTime and messaging, because she loved to write letters. And when she was campaigning for the medical school to bring that important issue about medical education to national attention, she wrote hundreds of letters, hundreds. And those are all held in the archives up at Bryn Mawr College, where she was spending a lot of time in her later years. Now, she had a great friendship with 4 other women, and they called themselves the Friday Night. And I discovered that was after the book came out, I discovered that was a fairly common term for when people got together every couple Friday nights and they would go to the theater. Benjamin Franklin did this. So that was sort of a revelation to me. But anyway, so Mary and her friends in Baltimore would get together every Friday, every other Friday, or whenever, and they would go to the theater. They would go to musical performances. They would read books. And Carrie Thomas's father was a doctor. And one day they were in his library at his home, and they came across a book on anatomy. Now, this was a revelation for these young girls who had never really seen a lot of those pictures that were in the book. And so this really stirred their imaginations about the opposite sex. So yeah, they were young girls and they talked about love. They talked about sex. Mary never married. And she, which is sort of a footnote here, but this is why she was able to give so much money to the institution she wanted to give to, because she didn't have a husband who controlled her money. And but the girls, for the most part, were ambivalent about marriage. I believe out of the 5 of them, 3 of them did get married. But this was a time in the late 19th century when a lot of women did not get married, because there wasn't that stigma any longer about not being married as there had been before the Civil War. There were more job opportunities. Women did not have the same restrictions in the late 19th century as their mothers had in the early 19th century. So there was a lot more freedom. And there was a new phenomenon that Henry James wrote about in the Bostonians. And he wrote about this thing going on with women living together, and he called them Boston marriages. And the nature of these relationships was sort of unknown to us at this time. In the early writing of women's history, like 30, 40 years ago, a lot of these were interpreted as being sexual in nature or whatever. But I think we're finding now that not all of them were. Many of them many women just wanted to live together at that time because they weren't married. And who knows, women did not, they weren't confessional about private issues like we are in this time. So we can read their letters from back then, and women would profess to each other that they loved each other dearly, but was that love friendship love? Was it sexual love? We don't know. But women, for the most part, had a very close bond in those years. So that's how Mary was with her friends. But of course, they all, they had their arguments, especially when they were involved with starting the Bryn Mawr School and such. But no, they all did great things. They did great things.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome,
we have a
Allison.
question. We have a question from Nancy. Was Mary acquainted with, or did she support Mary Lyon, the founder of the first women's college, Mount Holyoke College, in 1837? Or did her loyalties run exclusively to Bryn Mawr College? And Nancy says, thank you.
Well, you're welcome in advance, Nancy. No, that was way before Mary's time. She was born in 1854. And so Mount Holyoke, I believe, was the first of the 7 sisters. I'm not sure, but I think so. And that was very much a groundbreaking college for young women. But no, Mary came along much later, and she was influenced. It's interesting about Mary and what I sort of put together about her life. She was influenced not only by the culture of the times, which allowed women to have fewer restrictions. But she was also influenced by her own personal relationships within her family. She had two older brothers, and they were both given plum jobs. Uh, Her oldest brother, Robert, became president of the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad after their father died. Her other brother, Harrison, took over the family business that their grandfather had started in 1800. And there was Mary, who was really the brightest of all of them. In fact, her father always said he wished she had been born a boy. Pardon me. But he had sons, but he knew that Mary was the most competent of his children. So she was a little bit, she was nonplussed about that her brothers, who she knew to be far less competent than she, and they really didn't have that much interest in the family business or in railroad business. And she did. She loved railroad business. And so she was influenced personally and also culturally by what was going on around her. So she was meant to be a great mover and shaker in women's issues. But I might add this. She loved to be behind the scenes. She never really liked to have the limelight focused on herself. She wanted other people to take the credit for what she made possible, which I think really reflects a great personality. So.
Yeah, thank you. We have a comment and a question from Alice Hirsch. I am an alumna of Bryn Mawr College and Johns Hopkins. Recently, Bryn Mawr addressed the anti-Semitic and racist views of M. Carey Thomas. And the question is, did Mary Garrett hold any of those same views?
Oh, thank you for that question, because that, again, brings up a lot of controversy. Oh, by the way, my daughter graduated from Bryn Mawr College too, class of 99, I think. Anyway, no, Mary was not like that. Carey Thomas was very, very outspoken, and she did have some racist views. Now, we have to remember, this is during the progressive era, which was not always so progressive. This was the era of Jim Crow, and there were a lot of anti-Semitic and racist views at that time. Mary was pretty worldly. She traveled with her family. She had a much wider worldview. And no, she did not write about that at all. And so I know when the Hopkins Medical School wanted to name their trustees' boardroom after Mary Garrett, they did a lot of research to see if there was anything in her writings that would reveal any sort of racist or anti-Semitic comments. And no, there were not. I did not get that feeling as I did my own research looking through hundreds of her letters. She was not like that at all.
So folks, I invite you again to submit any questions you have using that feature at the top of your screen. While I ask a follow-up question to Kathy, I wondered, Kathy, if you'd want to say a little bit. You mentioned that the boardroom at the medical campus has been named for Mary Elizabeth Garrett. I wonder if you could go over any more recent recognitions of her role in Hopkins history, and whether, I know that there are people who have advocated for recognition over the years. I think your book really did a lot to kind of remind people of that history, and there has been more and more recognition. What would you say the level of recognition, given her importance to Hopkins? How would you characterize that now? And do you think it needs to go any further than it's gone already?
Well, Jack, you might know the answer I'm going to give to this, but okay. So when President—
That wasn't quite a setup question, but it's—
No, that's all right. I'm happy to say it because I've been saying it for 20 years. When Daniel Coit Gilman, the first president of Hopkins, was looking for a donor for the medical school when the university was broke, and he looked high and low for a male donor because he wanted to avoid all these restrictions that he knew Mary Garrett had in mind. And he wrote that he was hoping that a quote, a man of large means would finance the medical school and have the school named after him. Now, I can just say the medical school is not named Mary Elizabeth Garrett Medical School. Now, as far as recognition for her, I don't think it's been overwhelming. For example, one of her conditions for starting the medical school was she wanted a building to be built on the medical campus that would commemorate the women who helped to bring the issue of medical education to a wider audience around the country. Mary had started what was called the Medical School Fund. And these were women who she had recruited through those hundreds of letters she wrote. They gave a lot of attention to the issue, but they didn't give a lot of money, which is why she had to give money. But she insisted that there be a building built to commemorate these women and the fund. And again, she did not want her name on it. She wanted women's names to be, the Women's Medical Fund name to be on it. So that building was built. It was built as one of, I think, the second or third building on the medical school campus. But it was torn down in 1979 because it was really too old for some of the new medical technology that needed to be housed in there. But it was never, so another building was built. It's now called the Preclinical Sciences Building, I think, which is not a very interesting name. And that's on the spot where the Women's Fund Memorial Building was located. So my feeling is, and my campaign is to get that building named for the women. And as far as other recognition for Mary Garrett, I don't think there's a lot. I know that there's a scholarship fund, there's a professorship named for her in literature over on the Homewood campus. But you know, there hasn't been, except for the trustees' boardroom, not a lot besides that. And I think they're, you know, she, as I mentioned in the beginning, she did so much for education, medical education and philanthropy and medical practice. Before she gave the gift to Hopkins, medicine was a very sorry and backward profession. And with the opening of the medical school, that really just catapulted everything a mile high. And so, no, she, I don't think she's gotten the recognition she deserves. So, but we're working on it. We're still working on it.
Right. We know I think a nice way to end, we have a comment from Curtis Gibbs. Curtis, thank you for joining us today. And Curtis writes, thank you for doing this today and bringing this important history to our attention. And I think that's a nice way to, I think it seems like that is it for our questions. Okay. So Kathy, you know, in terms of what you just said, I think the book that you wrote does so much to kind of remind us of Garrett's role and to kind of preserve that legacy for everyone at Hopkins, but, you know, also beyond. So we're really grateful to you for this. And then I just would remind you all that the book is available, both the hardcover is still available. The paperback is brand new. You can find those on the Hopkins Press website, press.jhu.edu. The discount code HJAY, J like Blue Jay, gets you a 25% discount. You can do that at checkout online, or you can, there's a phone number you can call as well to order books at your discount. But we wish you all a very wonderful continued virtual alumni weekend.
I'm a struggling author. Buy the book. I'm a struggling author.
Yes, buy the book. The help an author. That's always, you know, that should be our bumper sticker.
Right.
We're grateful to our organizers at Alumni Weekend. We hope you enjoy the rest of the virtual events. And we really are sincerely grateful to Kathy Sander for both for this book, but also for taking time to talk to us today. So
my pleasure.
Thank you all for joining us, and we wish you all well and safety and health. And we'll see you back in Baltimore as soon as possible. Thanks very much.
Great.
Thank you, Kathy.
Stay well, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.